Hello, my name is Jenna Dykman, and I'm an Extension faculty member up in Cache County. And today we'll be cooking a stuffed pepper recipe. We'll be getting the recipe from this Type 2 Diabetes Cookbook. And it's a great recipe, a great dinner recipe that you can cook for a small group or a large group. We'll be using a lot of fresh ingredients for this stuffed pepper recipe. We'll be using, of course, peppers. The recipe calls for 4 red bell peppers, but sometimes peppers can get expensive. So a couple of options that you can use when buying peppers is you can buy the 3-pack of peppers, and they tend to be a little bit more budget friendly. Or if the peppers are on sale, you can always buy them individually as well. So just because the recipe calls for red bell peppers, you can use any color of peppers and they'll still work for this recipe. Also, we'll be using some great seasonings. The recipe calls for garlic and basil. When you're prepping a meal, sometimes it can take longer to prep fresh garlic, so you can always buy the pre-minced garlic, and that's a great option as well. And also, if you're using any sort of herbs, depending on the recipe, you can use fresh herbs or you can use pre-prepared herbs. And that's what we'll be using today because it will be going into the cooked meat that we'll be using, and so it'll just be adding flavor to the recipe. If you're making a salad or something where you're sprinkling the herbs on top, it is better to use the fresh herbs for that recipe. So before we start prepping any of the food, we gotta prep some of our kitchen utensils. So first things first, let's preheat our oven, and we'll just preheat that to 350 degrees. And then we'll be using a 9x9 baking dish for this recipe. This recipe makes about 4 stuffed bell peppers. If you're cooking for more than 4 people, you can double the recipe and just use a larger baking dish for this recipe. But we'll want to spray this just with some cooking spray so the peppers don't stick to the baking dish. Now that this is prepped, you can just set it aside and we'll start cooking the filling for our peppers. First things first, we gotta prep our peppers so they'll be ready to get the filling in them. With the peppers, we're just gonna cut off the top of the pepper and then get the inside out so it's ready to be stuffed. So sometimes they're a little bit weirdly shaped, but that's okay, it'll all work out. So you'll just cut off the top of the pepper and then just set this aside. You don't have to throw away the top. You can always cut out the top of the pepper and eat the rest of it just for a snack the next day or something like that. And now that we've cut off the top of the pepper, we just want to get the inside of the pepper out so it'll ready to have the filling in the pepper. So you can use a spoon to get the filling out of the pepper, or you can just break it off with your hands, whatever works best for you. Now that we've got the filling out of the peppers, we can just put them in the dish, the baking dish, and then set them aside. And once we have our filling ready to go, we'll stuff the peppers. So for this recipe, we'll use a sweet onion, and you'll just use half of the onion, and we'll want to dice up the onion and get it ready to be cooked in with the ground meat. So when cutting an onion, there's a lot of different ways to cut an onion. I just like to cut the onion in half and leave the base of the onion, this part right here, still intact. And then I cut the onion into strips. and I go almost all the way to the end, not quite, so then they stay together nicely. And then you'll just have a little bit left of the onion, and I just chop it a few more times, and then you can throw away the rest of the onion. So now we've got our onion ready to go. This recipe, it calls for tomato, or you can use pre-diced tomato, whatever you prefer, and whatever's easiest for your prep time. So today we'll be using olive oil. You can use about 1 to 2 teaspoons of olive oil, or you can also use cooking spray, whichever one you prefer. When you pour in your olive oil, you can measure about 1 to 2 teaspoons, or you can just eyeball it, whatever you're most comfortable with. And once you pour in the oil, you want to make sure that you move the oil around in the pan to make sure it gets to all parts of the pan. And from there, we'll be adding our ground meat to the recipe. This recipe calls for ground turkey. You can use ground turkey, ground pork, ground chicken. These are all great options. They're lean meats and lower in fat. Or you can also use ground beef if that's what you prefer. You'll notice I'm wearing gloves. I like to wear gloves when I'm working with meat. You don't have to use gloves, but we want to make sure after we handle raw meat that we do wash our hands. So as we get the meat out of the package, we'll just want to crumple it up as we put it in to the pan. And the goal of this step is to just brown the meat. So you'll want to break up the meat a little bit more and stir the meat around so it cooks evenly throughout the pan. So we'll cook this meat for about 6 minutes or until all the meat has been browned. So at this point the meat is looking really good. I've chopped it up into nice smaller pieces, and we'll cook it for about 2 to 3 more minutes to let it fully brown, and then we'll add in the rest of the ingredients. Now that we've browned the meat, we're gonna add the onions and 1 teaspoon of garlic. So I'll be using the pre-minced garlic and just add 1 teaspoon of that. It can be a heaping teaspoon of garlic that you can add in. If you like a little bit more garlic, feel free to add in another half a teaspoon or so. Then we'll add in our diced onions. And then we'll just stir this mixture around and cook it for about 3 minutes until the onions are translucent, or also known as a little bit see-through. So we've got our onions cooking. They look really good. They're that translucent color, so we're gonna add the rest of our ingredients. So we're gonna add some salt and pepper, and then basil and our tomatoes. So the recipe calls for about 1 diced tomato, so we'll add that in. And if you're using fresh basil, you'll use a half a teaspoon of fresh basil. With this, it's a 1-to-1 replacement. So I'll use a half a teaspoon of this pre-prepared basil. You'll just want to check the instructions if you're using pre-prepared herbs, just to see if the ratio is the same. Again, I am going to use a heaping teaspoon, half a teaspoon of basil. I do love the flavor, so I'll add a little bit more in. And then you'll do salt and pepper to taste. So maybe about a half a teaspoon to a teaspoon. The salt is optional if you are watching your sodium intake, and if you don't like pepper, you don't have to add pepper, but it gives it a nice flavor to it. Once you've got your ingredients in, you can stir it up. Once you've stirred your ingredients in, you don't need to cook it for too much longer, maybe about 1 to 2 more minutes. You want to make sure that the flavors are really seeping into the meat and mixing together well. And it's always important to taste your recipe just to see if it has the flavor that you want it to have. If it isn't as flavorful as you're hoping, you can add more salt or pepper, you can add some more garlic, or even some more basil to your dish. So now that we have our filling cooked, we are ready to stuff the peppers. You can wait a second and give the mixture a little time to cool, do some dishes if you want, and then come and stuff the peppers. But make sure that you're holding on to the peppers, and if you drop anything, you don't get it on your hands. So I'll just be using a measuring cup to fill the pepper up, and then as it gets more full, you can just use a spoon to top off the rest. So you'll take the mixture from the skillet or from your pan and just dump it in to the pepper. And you'll want to fill it until it gets about to the top of the pepper, just to make sure we have enough filling for all of the peppers. You can fill the pepper over your baking dish or over the pan. If you fill it over the pan, that's a little bit easier because if it falls out, it just falls back into the pan. Once you have your peppers stuffed and ready to go, you can top them with some feta cheese. So we just want a little water in here to give it some steam when we're cooking the peppers, and you can move the dish around to make sure the water gets to all parts of the baking dish. And then you'll cover the baking dish with aluminum foil and put it in the oven for 40 minutes.